All right. Good morning. I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay. Welcome to the challenge scoping event for IPEC 2023-2024 community. My name is Helen Tartaglia and I will be taking you through the webinar today. Next slide, please, Kat. So we've got a fairly jam-packed agenda this morning. Just a couple of bits from my side. First of all, this is an interactive event. So when you're not talking, please do make sure you are muted. And we welcome cameras on. So if anybody wants to pop their camera on, please feel free. So we will run through a few welcomes. My colleague Rakesh will then run through an introduction to IPEC. I will then take you through the kind of challenge scoping introduction, followed by a Q&A. We will then have a short workshop and a thank you and closing comments. So just a note on that, as we have got quite a jam-packed agenda. If you do have any questions, please note them down or drop them in the chat. We will have time at 11:30 to answer any questions.
Hello.
Hello.
Please. Yeah, please. Madam, could you, some noise is getting from that side. I know.
Oh, can nobody hear me?
Yeah, it's okay. But background of that, maybe noise is...
there's some back...
Yeah, madam.
There's some background noise. Okay, can everyone make sure they're muted? Otherwise, Nick, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, Helen, I think you're coming through clearly to me. I have just put another reminder in the chat. If everyone can mute, that might help out. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that note. Brilliant. So if we go on to the next slide. So we've got a wonderful team here with me today. So we've got Rakesh, who is head of IPEC. Myself, I'm a design researcher, and my colleague Trusha, who is a service designer. We've then got our facilitators, Nick, who is service design lead, and Jonathan, who is our senior technologist. Unfortunately, we don't have time for introductions from our audience today, but if you could please drop your name, job title, and your interest in this webinar in the chat, that would be really welcomed. And next slide, please. So a few objectives for today. So just a little bit of an outline of what I would like you to go away with. First of all, we'd like to educate and raise knowledge around challenge scoping and why it's vital for successful procurement. We'd like to give everyone some practical experience in scoping innovative challenges, particularly looking at how you select them and then begin to start that research. And then last but not least, we'd like to gather a little bit of information on the net zero innovation challenges local authorities and organisations are interested in, where there are kind of shared priorities and where the catapult can intervene. Next slide, please. So I will now hand over to my colleague Rakesh, who is going to do an introduction to the IPEC programme.
Thank you, Helen. So I'm Rakesh Shah. I'm the head of the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Centre. And just to set the scene, the public sector spends around £300 billion a year on public procurement. And just locally through local authorities, we spend about 60 billion. So what's happening now is the technology is changing at such a fast rate, and the types of innovators that are out there has changed drastically over the last 10, 15 years. So if we think about startups, scale-ups, large corporates with R&D departments, accelerators, academic institutes, there's a wide array of an ecosystem of innovators out there. And in our view, there's an opportunity here for UK PLC, both at central government and local government, to exploit some of the opportunities. And there's an opportunity to create new value. And by new value, we mean do things better, do things cheaper, do things quicker, do things greener, do things fairer. There are lots of opportunities out there. And what I saw at the Innovation Hub that we created at Transport for London, where I've just joined from, is we created many co-creation partnerships, whether they're with big tech players, tech platform owners, whether they're startups, or whether they're large corporates. And fundamentally, it was about creating shared value and creating value for the public sector. So at IPEC, we have the exciting challenge of working with you to lead the charge on how we get best value from public sector innovation and how do we do it at scale. It's not just about doing accelerators and pausing at the R&D, it's about realizing the benefits. And what we're looking to do through IPEC is create the right tools, the right thought leadership, the academic rigor that changes the way the public sector innovates with the market. And linked to this, I'm delighted to say that IPEC will be providing some funded resource to help you run your next innovation challenge. We'll bring a wide range of resources at no cost to you and will complement your team. So if you're a local authority, please do take some time to visit our website. That's ipec.org.uk. We're about to update our pages later this week, and we really are looking for expressions of interest who we could work with and provide some resource to for a challenge that kicks off in April 24. Otherwise, please just feel free to contact me or the team on LinkedIn. And then in terms of today, I'm really excited about today because what Helen, Nick, and Tricia are doing is to focus on a key area that helps innovation work. And it's focusing on the right foundations to develop a good innovation challenge. And quite often from my experiences, sometimes we start off with the wrong problem statement with the wrong context. And then what happens at the end is you produce the wrong outputs and the innovation's not worked. So getting the foundation stage right is really critical. The team will set out the importance of this, but also give you some practical tips that you can take away and apply in your own organization. So I hope you take much away from the session today. We're also shaping future sessions. So if you've got ideas and thoughts on what we should be running, please do drop me a note, drop the team a note. But all the best to you today, and I'll hand back to Helen. Thanks, Helen.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rakesh. Next slide, please. So as kind of outlined, I am going to provide a little bit of an introduction to challenge scoping. Today's session will just be a kind of high level quick fire step by step, but hopefully provide you with a little bit of information in regards to what challenge scoping is, why it's so incredibly important for the procurement process, a little bit on how we do it here at CPC, and then some practical guidance in terms of how we've done it with other local authorities and organisations, and how you can use it should you require it during your own innovation procurement processes. So if we go to the next slide. So what is challenge scoping? So challenge scoping, in short, is the process of learning more about, defining and refining complex challenges faced by an organisation, business or society. It's twofold. It defines what the key problems and drivers are and then begins to think about how they might be resolved, very heavily relying on systems thinking approaches to do so. So in short, what we're really trying to do is truly understand a problem or a challenge before we begin to go about trying to resolve it. Next slide, please. So here I've got a very, very simple diagram just to try and explain, to explain in detail what that process looks like. So that scribbly line there is our complex challenge or our knotty problem. If we then go to the next slide, we then begin to do some research to understand that complex challenge in its entirety. So the metaphor I like to use is we begin to iron it out and understand all the causes, all the drivers, all the symptoms. Next slide. We then break our challenge down into sub-challenges or actionable insights. So these are the points at which we begin to procure against or begin to take action against. So we look at what key aspects of that challenge we can begin to respond to, and we'll begin to think about how. So if we go on to the next slide. When looking at our actionable insights, we begin to get a bit of an understanding as to what can respond to that. So you might have 2 or 3 challenges that can be responded to via technology or innovative solutions. Next slide. You might have 3 that are at a much more macro level. So this could require policy intervention, it could require infrastructural or strategic changes at an organisational level, or it could require further funding, so on and so forth. And then last but not least, on the next slide, we have our micro level engagement. So one or two of your challenges could involve behavioural change at a household or community level. It could involve raising awareness, or it could involve kind of better strategic community engagement. So if we go to the next slide. So why do we do challenge scoping? Why is this important for the procurement process? So I think first and foremost, and the most kind of key issue here, is it's really about avoiding implementing the wrong solution. So oftentimes what we see is that solutions fail because they never really understood the problem they were trying to resolve in the first place. What often happens is this results in lots of wasted money and time, but also a real distrust in emerging or innovative solutions. So we tend to then go back to the kind of tried and tested, they work but not that well solutions that we know will vaguely bring us some return on investment, but not much. Secondary to that is that technology alone will not save the day. As I've kind of illustrated in those last slides, by doing challenge scoping, it enables us to see the full spectrum of problems and the different solutions required to resolve those problems. So whilst you might be procuring for innovative solution or tech, you can also understand that that can only perform to its best should policy level engagement be there, or should your internal strategic alignment be there. And then last but not least, it's really about engaging relevant stakeholders early on. So challenge scoping or challenge research should always be at the start of your procurement process, project or program. Really, what this enables you to do is understand who is involved in this project, in this problem. So who are the key stakeholders, who are the experts, who are the end users, who are the beneficiaries. You are able to engage them very early on and then keep up their engagement throughout the procurement process. So this might even include calling on them again to trial a technology or solution, or to give some feedback when selecting them. Next slide, please. So what is the challenge scoping process and how do we do it here at Connected Places Catapult? So we've got a very simple 3.5 stage process. This is one that I use to explain this process internally and externally. It is a CPC framework. It's not a kind of industry-wide agreed upon framework, but it does give us a bit of a shared understanding as to how we do this. So we start with challenge research, we then go through to challenge definition, challenge selection, and then the final slide, the final point, which is challenge refinement, which is a kind of optional step that I'll explain in a little bit more detail later on. What I am going to do today is take you through each of these steps in a little bit more detail. I'm also going to call upon the example of Local Authority X, who are a local authority that we worked with back in 2021, who we took through this whole process into a kind of trial for procurement stage. So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to introduce to you Local Authority X. So Local Authority X approached CPC in 2021, having observed repeat hospital admissions in their area because of cold, damp and mold in homes, particularly in their kind of traditional terrace housing. Local Authority X wanted to run a technology trial for in-home sensors to detect cold, damp and mold, and they wanted to procure 1 or 2 of those sensors to ease the problem. So in essence, we had room for 8 SMEs with 2 or 3 to be procured at the end. There were a couple of issues from the jump with what they'd kind of proposed to us. The first being that this was what we call a solution-led approach, i.e. we were kind of presuming that we understood the solution and were therefore overriding or not leaving room for any other kind of innovative approaches or ideas to respond to the problem. The second issue with this was it wasn't clear to us what the key drivers were for cold and damp homes in the area, and therefore whether sensors really were the answer or if there were some other kind of key drivers that we should be attending to too. So if we go to the next slide. So we started off by proposing this kind of new way of working to the authority, and they agreed. So we then began by taking them through what we call challenge research. So challenge research is really about exploring the complex problem in its entirety. This phase remains purposefully complex and holistic. I call this the headache phase. If you've not got a headache and feel a bit confused and overwhelmed in this phase, then you need to be doing a bit more research. But in short, we just want to know what all the problems and drivers are associated with that big challenge. So you go as wide as you possibly can. So in order to do this, we carry out some desk research. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We look at other research that's been done, be that at a UK level, an international level, or at a local level. We do some stakeholder mapping. So we begin to map out who the key people are involved in this challenge, be that experts, end users, so on and so forth. We then go into our expert and user research. So it's really key here that we talk to all of these people, we run interviews, workshops and focus groups, and we engage those key stakeholders. And then last but not least, we might do some tech scanning or some brainstorming. So if we go to the next slide. So here, what's really kind of key is that from the jump, you get your project team engaged early on. So from a council perspective, these might be some of the teams that you engage with, and that you begin to think about who is involved in the core project team and who is just engaging in terms of expert feedback, interviews, so on and so forth. Next slide. So for Local Authority X, the start of this process looked a little bit like this. So fairly simple. We did some desk research, some stakeholder mapping. We then did 5 expert interviews and 5 user interviews. So with our experts, I believe we had a district nurse, we had a representative from adult social care, we had 2 representatives from the third sector. So I believe Groundworks was the key charity. And then last but not least, we also spoke to a GP. And then for our user interviews, we spoke to 3 people who were living in cold and damp homes and 2 who were at risk or managing cold and damp homes effectively without the kind of help of council services. This then moved into us brainstorming all the outputs of that research. So if we move to the next slide. So our brainstorm looked a little bit like this. So fairly simplified version, but what we began mapping out was all the causes and symptoms of cold and damp homes and where the knock-on impacts were. So for example, cold and damp homes often cause social isolation. Social isolation often means kind of accepting the situation or not knowing where to go, which in turn then makes the kind of causes of cold and damp homes worse. Or a kind of lack of funds or services at a government level meant that Local Authority X couldn't provide the services they would like to, and therefore this was also having a knock-on impact. Next slide, please. So once we'd mapped out all of our kind of key problems, we then begin to go into what we call challenge definition. So as I said earlier, challenge definition in short is beginning to create sub-challenges that create actionable insights. They're kind of jumping off points from which we can begin to develop solutions or procure for them. So here, a kind of key methodology is what we call in the design research world, group synthesis sessions. So in short, synthesis is about sitting down with the whole project team, bringing together all of those research findings and those brainstorms and beginning to form an overview of the challenge so that you can break it down into those sub-challenges. A key kind of output for this phase is delivering a final challenge report. So here we will bring together all of that research and those kind of sub-challenges and send them back out to our stakeholders, maybe even our end users, as a kind of asset that can be built on and used going forward. And we also develop what we call how might we statements, which I will explain in a little bit more detail later on. But in short, these take our sub-challenges, they turn them into questions, and they ask, how might we resolve X, Y, and Z? Next slide, please. So for Local Authority X, as I said, this was the output of our challenge research. If we go into our next slide. We then take away those arrows and we are just left with themes. And then into the next slide, we begin to identify some of those themes. So if we just flick through, please, we've got house, services, and person. And then again, we have got the sub-themes of typology, environmental factors, occupancy type, and again, accessibility and access to information. And then the last one, we've got lifestyle, socioeconomic factors, awareness, and ability. And if we add those arrows back in, thank you. So we can then see our themes, our sub-themes, and how they're all connected. And then if we jump one final slide, we then begin to define those challenges through challenge definition. So at the top here, we've got how might we quickly identify and resolve the causes of a property being either damp, cold, or both. Then into something much more specific at the bottom. So for example, how might we reduce the burden placed on visiting healthcare practitioners to deal with issues in patients' properties. So what we begin to do is map out key points on that map where we think we can intervene and develop those into how might we statements. So for example, for healthcare practitioners, when we ran our interviews, one kind of key bit of feedback was that for a lot of older, more vulnerable, isolated people, actually the only people that are visiting their homes are the healthcare practitioners, and those are the people that are identifying cold and damp. They're well placed to do so, but there's no infrastructure for them to then be able to report back. So healthcare practitioners were spending a lot of time dealing with those issues, and we needed a solution that streamlined that issue into a kind of reporting mechanism that then that problem could be resolved. So that is what Local Authority X produced. And if we go into the next slide, we then go into challenge selection. So what we have at the end of challenge definition is a huge variety of challenges. So you can have up to a list of 20. You then want to begin to very carefully select which ones you think can be resolved via the procurement process, or if it's kind of developing policy strategy, which ones could be resolved that way. So you might want to ask yourself the following questions. What resources do you have available to you? What is happening on the market? So if it is that you're looking for this to be responded to by a market-ready technology, are there any technologies out there responding to this? And if not, what are the other kind of routes we can go to source that technology? If they're not there, are they kind of looking at different use cases? Do we need to source them that way? So on and so forth. So some of the methodologies for this include a focused tech scan, where we begin to look at technologies available and whether any of them are relevant to this challenge. You might also do a focused horizon scan, so looking at upcoming strategies, policies, funds, so on and so forth. And then last but not least, you want to run some workshops with your stakeholders and potentially also your end users, as well as the whole project team, to select which challenges they think are most pertinent. So which they think are most important, but also which they think are feasible and viable for the process you are taking. Next slide, please. So last but not least, we've got optional step number 4, which is challenge refinement. So we do this a lot at CPC because we go out to market with what we call briefs or trial briefs. So we put our how might we statements out into the world, and we get SMEs to come back and apply and tell us why they think their product, tool, or technology can respond to that challenge. So challenge refinement is really about preparing those challenge statements for an open call, thinking about where you're going to put that. Is it worded in a way that people in this area who are not experts can understand? What type of information are you putting out? Are you putting out just enough, so not too much that you're drowning people with information, but enough that they kind of fully understand what it is you're trying to resolve, so on and so forth. So here we strongly recommend working with your kind of marketing and comms team, thinking carefully about your strategy for engagement with some of those challenges. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, that is the process in full. I can't kind of give you too much detail about what happened with Local Authority X, but what I can say is that they had 10 SMEs in the end, so I think a few more than we'd originally discussed, and 5 different types of solutions. So we had 2 in every category that looked at the problem in a much more holistic way. 2 of them were sensors, so they weren't completely wrong. There was a requirement for in-home sensor, but there was also a requirement for kind of B2B identification tools, data capture tools, and a few on like kind of how we better roll out services to communities. So that is it for me. I think we've got some time for some Q&A now. So if we go to the next slide. Were there any questions?
Yeah, I've just put something in the chat. So if anyone has any questions about anything Helen's raised, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll kind of pick people out, maybe ask you to say it out loud if you want to, or add anything to it. Otherwise, we can take it straight from the chat. But yeah, type away in there. I have a question whilst we're waiting, Helen. I think my question would be, when we look at that overall process, and given the amount of interactions we've had with local authorities, do you think that there's any particular area where local authorities across the board really struggle, and it's kind of a part that they maybe don't even think of as part of the process, or struggle for other reasons, be it resources and time and so on?
Yeah, that's a good question. The one thing I've seen time and time again is that actually authorities know these problems really well and they're very well equipped to deal with them. It's the cross-authority communication that is sometimes a barrier. So we often find that actually by doing challenge research, the most pivotal part is that authorities are taking the time out to go and speak to their colleagues in adult social care or speak to their colleagues in the net zero teams, and then bringing all of that knowledge together into one central hub. So that's the bit I think they struggle with, and the bit that they tend to kind of benefit the most from in this process. I guess to add to that, one thing that I didn't mention that we are quite proactive at doing at CPC is that we don't tend to work as a consultant, but rather as a kind of collaboration agreement. So a lot of the research we did with Local Authority X, they actually carried out with our support. So we weren't doing the focus groups or interviews on their behalf. They were actively engaged in carrying out those conversations themselves, which I think was also really helpful.
Cool. And I think we have our first question in the chat. Quite a demanding one in the sense that, did the local authority procure all the solutions? Issue with going through the process and then no procurement at the end. Alistair, did you want to add anything to that?
Hi everybody, Alistair here from Belfast City Region. No, it's just we have a bit of experience, not ourselves personally, but the central government in Northern Ireland with running SBRI programs, Small Business Research Initiative, which is the same sort of thing where you go through and you procure a solution. But there has been a bit of an issue with a bit of a cliff edge that by the time a solution is developed, maybe the needs or the problem has changed so that the actual local authority or whoever the client is doesn't actually then procure the solution. And we've had some feedback from SMEs, that have gone through a prolonged process, developed a solution, and then at the end only to find that there's no customer at the end. So that's a bit of an issue. Just interested in hearing a bit about it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I believe they only procured one in the end. I would need to double check. I think the key barrier actually was that when we went through the trial stage, a couple of them, although promising, the TRL wasn't high enough. So actually they weren't quite as market ready as we wanted them to be, which I will put my hands up and say is one kind of lesson we learned from kind of going through the selection and filtering process, which I didn't cover in these, but is something we do. Another issue we've kind of found, and this is slightly what IPEC was born from, is the fact that procurement through trial is great as long as the framework at the end doesn't swallow the SME alive, which was another thing we were then having to try and tackle, is actually how do you build a trial or piloting process and procurement process for the local authorities in the first place. Some of them have slightly different processes, but actually it's quite difficult. So in short, yes, one was procured in the end, but they were a slightly bigger business, higher TRL, and the other one that was really successful wasn't, just because smaller business, lower TRL.
Yeah, and I also just want to touch on something that Alistair mentioned there, which is SBRI. IPEC addresses a slightly different part of the kind of journey than SBRI, but we are very much in touch with SBRI, and everyone may know of Malcolm Harbour, one of our associate directors. He is in fact actually at an SBRI meeting this morning, so we're very much aware of SBRI, and it kind of factors into the IPEC offering, but slightly different. I see Rikesh has put something in chat. Rikesh, do you want to come off mute as well?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And perhaps just going back to the previous question as well. I mean, what I found at Transport for London was
Well, Rikesh,
yep.
I don't know if it was just me, but maybe a bit of a connection issue. You're back now.
Am I back? Sorry, apologies. Just going back on the previous question. I mean, what I found at Transport for London was you have to design a competition and embed the procurement, assuming the R&D would work. So you don't do the R&D and then stop and then restart. And that means that sometimes the trialing doesn't work and it's not relevant, but that's where you pivot, you test, and then you decide whether you close it or not. So I think embedding the procurement process right at the beginning is important. Might take a few weeks, but it will save you time and stress downstream. My specific question to Helen was, Helen, there's lots of different stakeholders internally in an organization, you know, with all those people that you listed. How did you align them to sort of come to a common problem statement or a common challenge goal, given all the different stakeholder perspectives?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually another great kind of outcome of doing challenge scoping properly. So I think the first key thing is, when you're in that challenge research phase, is looking at exactly who you need to engage and engaging them in the correct way. So you go to them with your big problem and you listen to them. It sounds really basic, but you know, you interviews your focus groups, actually listen to what they have to say. Map all of those inputs and outputs out. What you also want to do is kind of sweeten them up a little bit. So, i.e., we really value your expert opinion, or we really value you as a citizen of our community, blah, blah, blah. Can we have your input later down the line? We don't want to get this wrong. And in order to get this right, we need to hear from you later on. So once you've done your interviews and you've brought all of that research together in that definition phase, and you've pulled together your challenge statements, what you want to do is bring all those people back together in a room and present it back to them as thoroughly as you can. So, you know, a slide deck with the sort of key inputs and outputs and all that kind of stuff works really well. You present to them the how might be statements or the challenge statements, and then first of all, what are your initial thoughts? And again, you then want to encourage them to disagree. So if anybody thinks that you're wrong, or that a rewording needs to be done, or you know, you might have things such as, oh, you know, we in adult social care think X, Y, and Z, but actually this goes against what's happening in net zero. Well, okay, why is that? What's the sort of tension here? What's happening? What's the kind of different strategies? So it's a lot of engaging people in the proper ways, getting them in a room together and allowing them to talk, and being clear that their input is vital. And then last but not least, the voting process, and then kind of clearly showing that, okay, so you voted for these challenges, now we're going out to market with them. Will you help us then select the SMEs or the technologies, or will you help us review the applications? So in short, sorry, that was a very long answer, but in short, it's about actually valuing people's inputs and not just paying them lip service, and making sure they're involved throughout.
Yep, absolutely. All stakeholder relations and kind of connections are really important across, whether it's inside of a local authority or outside. But in the short term in IPEC, we're really trying to help local authorities with those internal relationships so that everybody can have their ship going in the right direction internally. And that makes it a lot easier to reach out to external stakeholders and build those relationships. We have a couple of minutes left. I see a question from Dr. Samaya. Hi, everyone. How did consider change selection to solve the deeper issues in research? Dr. Samaya, do you want to add something quickly by coming off mute?
Hi, Helen.
Hi there. We can hear you.
Yeah, hi, Nikki. This is some of the challenges for the critical research. There is I think, huge team is required, but there are certain kind of projects like in a defense applications. We did a projects for Indian government here. We need facing a lot of problems to solve some of the deeper issues in the research kind of. So how we face that, what are the key points to consider to do such certain kind of research projects?
Oh, sorry, Helen.
Sorry,
you're
madam.
mute.
You are mute, madam.
Sorry. I can hear me now.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. So is that in terms of the sort of complex challenges you can't unlock? So, for example, kind of government-led staff, funding, so on and so forth, things like that, or is that? Yeah, is that what you can? Okay, so I think it's twofold, and I think that's why I kind of showed the actionable insights slide, and then highlighting which of those can be resolved by what. You won't resolve everything by doing a challenge scoping process. You might know what all your problems are, but you won't have the answers to all of them. And certainly technology alone, as I said earlier, will not resolve some of them. It's a kind of twofold process. So you can kind of either accept that it is what it is and resolve or ease what you can, or you can, for example, and this is what CPC do a lot, is we'll select technologies or innovations that work, and then we go to government and say, this works, but they need the funding, or policy needs to change. Or we'll go to the local authority and say, look, this works great, but you need to kind of look at your kind of organizational infrastructure changes there. So sometimes it's about going for what you can do and using it as a Trojan horse to tackle the bigger problems. It's very blue sky thinking. It doesn't always work, but the louder you can shout about something and say, look, we actually did something in the real world, we've got something here, X, Y, Z needs to change to make this change. It's kind of like a useful route in. I hope that sort of answers the question.
Yeah, so fine.
Yeah, I think it's
thank you, Helen. Yeah, thank you, Helen.
Thanks, Dr. Samaya. Yeah, I think it's a really great point, Helen, and hopefully it came through in the slides as well with the systemic grouping, is that sometimes a local authority isn't the best placed organization to solve everything themselves. Sometimes excellent challenge research can kind of highlight areas where we need to bring in other organizations outside of the local authority, not just SMEs to procure from, but it may be VCFS or citizen groups or central governments and so on and so on. So yeah, I think a really good question and a good point there, Helen. I think that brings us just about up to time on the Q&A section, which means we'll be moving into the practical activity. I think it will be very relevant based on the questions that have been asked. Hopefully everyone can see the Miro-board link on screen and the password. I will also pop it in chat. as you can see, there is a link to Miro. If you haven't used Miro before, quite simply, it's a big whiteboard. We've laid out a little activity for everyone to do. Trusha, one of our facilitators, will be sharing her screen and guiding us through that activity. You'll notice in the post I've put in the chat that there is a password. So the password is IPEC, all in caps. So IPEC 2023 exclamation mark. So when you click the link to Miro, it will ask you for a password. Please just copy paste that in or type it in, and you should be able to see a big whiteboard with post-it notes and activities laid out.
Can I please request Kat to, yeah, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Trusha, and I am a service designer here at Connected Faces Catapult. And I'm going to facilitate this session today. And I'll be supported by Helen, Nick, and Jonathan. Sorry, can everyone see my screen?
We can't know.
Sorry, just 1 second.
I think it might be loading now.
Okay. Wait, is it working now?
Still loading.
Yeah, I guess we are having a bit of a tech issue. Should be loading in a minute.
I'll say at this point as well, if anyone else does have any questions immediately related to the slides that Helen presented or anything like that, chuck them in the chat and we might get a chance to answer them in the next section as well. Brilliant. So thank you everyone for participating in the workshop exercise, the activity there. Lots of useful information which will help us in terms of identifying excellent innovation challenges. And of course, the reason that we want to both help you improve your innovation challenge scoping in this session, but also understand what areas you are trying to do innovation challenge scoping in, is because we have fully funded support, as Rikesh previously mentioned, which means we have funding from IUK with which to support many of the local authorities in the UK. We're going to do this in various ways. One way, for example, as Rikesh mentioned, is that we're going to update our website this week, and it will have more information on a cohort, so a group of local authorities who can learn together and receive our support in partnership through their end-to-end innovation procurement journey. We will also be releasing things like recordings of these sessions on the website, potentially toolkits and information, research artifacts, things like that. So plenty to look out for. And again, the website is ipec.org.uk. And also we have further community smarter spending events like this coming up in the near future. So again, check out the Connected Places Catapult events page for more on those events, or ipec.org.uk. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.